Okay, well, we will get started here now. I'd like to welcome you to the John Carter Brown Library and thank you for braving the weather. Soon we will be braving snow, and this will seem very mild in comparison. So thanks for coming out. I wanted to begin by talking about the poster, the image that I hope many of you saw on the advertisement that we did for this evening's lecture. It is a map, a 1619 map of America by Jodocus Hondius, I thought that in many ways it exemplified some of the themes not only that our evening's lecture will be discussing this evening, but also some of the ways in which we here at the library are attempting to think in interconnected and interwoven ways about the history of the word that appears on the top of this map, America. This is obviously a map of the hemisphere and a map of the American continent, but it is also a map that shows other parts of the world that seem to be peering out into this hemisphere from different places. At the far right, you have the continent of Africa. Barely visible. You have the British Isles, Anglia, that appear in the upper right. And of course you have on the left-hand side the Mar del Sur, or Mare Pacificum, which is in many ways the trajectory that Joan-Pau Rubiés is going to be discussing this evening, among other connections, of course. And so already you have a map that is presenting itself about one thing, but it is also telling us that that thing is embedded in other things, other connections, other pathways, that in many ways it is our obligation, I think, certainly those of us at this institution, to explore and examine. We also see on the lower left-hand portion of the image two different interconnected, we might want to say discourses, graphic discourses in this case, that link together the history of ethnography, the observation and writing about the peoples of these lands, and also the history of natural history, that is the history of animals, the history of plants, intimately and intricately connected to the history of peoples and the populations of the Americas. In this case, these are, I believe they're called Americos in Brasiliae. These are the famed cannibals munching variously on different parts of the human body, but I really draw the attention more to the fact that it was seen as a unified discourse in many ways of observation in the human and the animal realm, and undoubtedly, even though I haven't had too much of a preview of what Joan-Pau will be discussing this evening, that interconnection and interwoven nature will come out. So America has always been embedded in a global context, and America has always been embodied in a natural, historical, and ethnographic context. This lecture tonight, which is sponsored by an endowment, an annual lecture endowment from Maury Bromsen, is traditionally been reserved for a scholar of Latin American history and culture. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Maury Bromsen and then muse a little bit on how Maury Bromsen might have imagined this evening's presentation. Maury Bromsen, as many of you know, was a bibliographer, a bibliophile, and a bookman with a major connection to the JCB for many years until his death in 2005. He provided the legacy that sponsors this evening's lecture, but his support also makes possible an annual concert every year. This year will be on the 1st of November. A curatorial position in Latin American books, ongoing cataloging and conservation efforts as well that help our collection tremendously. Mr. Bromsen left 10,000 books to the JCB, ranging in time from the early 16th century through the 20th, and in geographic coverage from Argentina to Canada. So from this treasure trove, we acquired and adopted 1,500 imprints and over 600 manuscripts having to do with the Americas during the colonial and independence periods. So Maury Bromsen's name, of course, is very closely associated with the Latin American part of our collection. And so in many ways, I wonder how Bromsen would have seen our inviting Joan-Pau Rubiés to give this evening's lecture, and more broadly looked at the library's efforts to place Latin America and the Americas more broadly into this global context. I would only hope that since he knew the shelves of this library rather well, and he would have made the same observation that I have since being here, which is that lining our shelves are in fact books that relate to that broader history. I like to look at the Portuguese section of our materials, which is lining that wall over there for both personal and professional reasons. But some of the books that first appear are those of the relations of the Portuguese in China, in India, and in Africa. So already here, in some of the earliest and most primordial moments of European expansion and European contact, we have these connections that I think are in many ways leaping out to us to make those connections. As part of this lecture, we are also happy to be able to invite with us to the JCB 4 scholars who will be discussing this idea of Americana in a global perspective tomorrow at 3 p.m. One is Lindsay Van Tyne, whom we welcome back from having been a fellow just very recently. Aisha Ramachandran, a former fellow who will be joining us from Yale University. Ben Breen, whom I don't see here yet, but hopefully will be arriving tomorrow, also, maybe later tonight. Former fellow, recently graduated from the University of Texas at Austin. And finally, Roquinaldo Ferreira, who is the Vasco da Gama Associate Professor of History and Portuguese and Brazilian Studies here at Brown. That will be taking place at 3 p.m. with Joan-Pau Rubiés' participation, and we look forward to having you there. So with that, I would like to introduce our evening speaker, Joan-Pau Rubiés, who is ICRA Research Professor at the Catalan Institute for Advanced Research at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Joan-Pau graduated in early modern history at the University of Barcelona in 1987, where he received the Extraordinary Degree Prize and went on to do a PhD at the University of Cambridge, funded through an external fellowship at King's College. He was subsequently Research Fellow at Queen's College, Cambridge, and Jean Monnet Fellow at the the European University Institute in Florence. In 1994, he became lecturer in modern history at the University of Reading, and in 1999, he joined the Department of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he was until 2012, when he took on his new position as research professor. I met Joan-Pau in 2003-ish, somewhere around there, where we were both participants in a conference, the inaugural conference of the Early Modern Studies Institute at the University of Southern California. And we found out that we shared an advisor in Anthony Pagden, and I was already familiar with Joan-Pau's work on the history of travel and ethnology, but since that time we have continued a very productive conversation, and I have learned a tremendous amount from his work, and we have moved toward collaborating on a variety of different projects. His early dissertation work was about the history of Iberian contact in South Asia, which resulted in a well-known publication entitled Travel and Ethnology in the Renaissance, South India Through European Eyes, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2000. And he has published too many articles, by his own admission, too many articles, period, but certainly too many articles to name here, and is currently working on a fascinating project that is provisionally entitled Europe's New Worlds, Travel Writing and the Origins of the Enlightenment, which will be published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. We're thrilled to have Joan-Pau with us this entire week, and very much look forward to his talk tonight entitled Ethnography and Natural History from the New World to the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming Joan-Pau.
Well, many thanks for this very generous introduction. And thanks to the JCB for welcoming me again after 24 years. I was here a fellow in 1991. And it's been a real pleasure to come back. I had the opportunity the last few days to have many conversations with Neil, but also with other members of the staff, past and future. I mean, past and present. Future too, I hope. And so it's been really nice to realize in retrospect how important my 3 months here were then, having worked on Asia. Spending 3 months here really allowed me to do something I always conceived of as essential, which is not to look at the history of early modern encounters by looking at each region in isolation of each other, by comparing what goes on in different areas. And my experience of the JCB was, of course, the experience of the Americas, in particular the Iberian part of the Americas, although I also read Roger Williams in honor of the founder of Providence. But I also felt here how true it is that we understand better what happens in the Americas if we think about Asia and Africa and vice versa in that period. Now, today's talk is going to be about the genre of natural history and the role of ethnography in it. And I have 3 aims. First of all, I will talk about some very well-known works, in particular José de Acosta's Natural and Moral History of the Indies, which I'm sure you all are aware of as one of the real highlights of Americana, one of the really important books, with huge influence all the way to the Enlightenment and even beyond that. But there are other works that are less well known because they were not published in the early modern period. And I will draw attention to some of those works as well, because I feel it's important sometimes to balance the famous with the less famous, which happen to be extremely interesting. The second aim of my talk is to focus on the issue of what is ethnography doing in natural history and for natural history, and what are the implications. And I'll raise a number of questions. I may not be able to answer them all in the space of my talk, but at least I hope I'll be able to make you feel that these are important issues. And my third aim is to, connecting to what Neil already advanced, is to rethink the boundaries of the New World by showing the extent to which this division between America and Asia was not a division that these writers that we'll be talking about considered to be important. All of them the three Jesuit writers I will discuss from the late 16th and 17th centuries discussed the Pacific world and the Philippines within their narrative of the New World. So let us begin with, Let us begin with what many people would take to be the first important natural history of the Americas. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who published his General History of the Indies in 1535, but before that, in 1526, his Summary of the Natural History of the Indies, which was an extract from the work he was doing. It is, again, a work that's extremely famous. It had huge impact throughout the Renaissance. It was translated into Italian very early on, and I think there's a brief display that Ken has prepared here, which has the Italian version already done in 1534, very early on by Ramusio. So it is an important work in terms of impact, intellectual impact, in the Republic of Letters. And it is one work that displays very clearly how from the very beginning, natural history included people, included the customs of human beings, or to use the expression of Oviedo himself, it included the manera de gentes, kinds of peoples, and ritos y ceremonias de aquellas gentes salvajes. That's how he calls them, not me. The rites and ceremonies of those savage peoples, together with elements of geography, of cosmography, the question of navigation, animals, land, sea and air included, and plants and elements from the land, including minerals, whether gold or other. This, therefore, is the vision of the Renaissance natural history. It's a comprehensive genre. And the problem, as I will explain later, is that the human is both within but outside nature. And I will try to draw the implications of that in my talk. Before I do that, however, let me say a couple more things about ethnography in the period, because ethnography appears in natural history, but it also appears in many other genres of the period. So it is important to see that natural history exists in connection with a number of other genres. The first one would be the relation, the relación. It is the building block of the discourse on human diversity in the early modern period. Samuel Purkis, famously in his cosmographical work, described reimagining the world as building a temple, which, because he was a very religious man, he considered to be like rebuilding the Temple of Solomon. And the discovery of the New World was to a very large extent an opening into rethinking the meaning of world history from a religious perspective. But the building blocks were the relations. So he published also his pilgrims as well as his pilgrimage. The pilgrimage was the religious vision. The pilgrims were the individual items by sometimes merchants or sailors or discoverers or soldiers, which created the base raw materials upon which to build a new history of the world that encompassed its huge diversity, natural and human. And then you find that whether they are relations written by missionaries, relations written by merchants, by discoverers, travelers like Vespucci, or, of course, Columbus, Pigafetta, who crossed the Pacific and wrote about it before anyone else, you find relations having an impact both by themselves, published as individual items, in compilations, such as, for example, just a minute, the very famous one, perhaps the greatest compilation of travel narrative, of relations with the period, the one by Giovanni Botero, someone who wanted to be Jesuit but was not accepted because he had a bad character, but nevertheless collaborated with the order, read all they had written about Asia and the Americas. For the Americas, he followed José de Acosta. For Asia, he followed very interesting materials about Japan, India, China, and other parts of Asia that were being then written up in the letters by the Jesuits. And he created these massive 4-volume universal relations, which again, like Percus, his Protestant counterpart, was meant to be at the service of a religious vision, a religious history of the world. It was not just sheer curiosity, it was also a way of rethinking world history. It was the materials for rethinking world history. So we have all these kinds of relations, and then we also have works inspired by humanist models, either works of history, like the famous works by Lope de Gomara, for example, works inspired by natural history. The Pliny here is the influence behind Fernández de Oviedo and others, and just works based on classical geography, like Strabo here is the key figure, and the genre that defines that tradition in the Renaissance is cosmography. So history, histories of conquests, cosmography, and natural history were the 3 great Renaissance high genres, which drew, nevertheless, all of them on the humble relations. And it is in those humble relations that you find the primary observations about human diversity that constitutes ethnography. Description of people's relations are descriptive accounts of everything people experience in their travels and discoveries. So this is the context for natural history. And what was important of natural history in particular, in that vast panorama, was that it was the key genre for rationalizing novelty. There has been a very big, famous debate, often discussed in this room, I believe, about the impact of the New World on the Old and the extent to which it was possible or not for 16th-century Europeans to appreciate and rationalize novelty. And this is very clearly at the heart of the concerns of Oviedo and later Acosta and every single writer I'll be talking about today, how to come to terms with novelty. And the interesting thing about natural history is that it provided a genre that was halfway between history and science in order to interpret novelty. The categories I described when I talked about Oviedo, which would be not different from the ones you will find when we deal with Acosta, will include, as I said, physical geography, cosmography, connected to navigation, connected to climate, connected to issues like the size of the Earth, the shape of the Earth, the way climate varies according to latitude or not. And on the other hand, it includes all the descriptions of plants and animals, often in connection to botany and medicinal uses, and then all the descriptions of animals, again, combining practical uses with just sheer description of diversity. And then minerals I've described. In the case of Acosta, one of the most kind of like popular topics for the German publisher to the degree who ordered some images of the book. He didn't want to say it was by a Catholic Jesuit, but he did want to publish the text and illustrate it, and he did do so with particular emphasis on the mines of Potosí, which of course had such an important economic impact in the period. Again, what you found on the earth was part of natural history. And then people of which this very crude representation by Oviedo is just the beginning of a very sophisticated analysis by the time we get to José de Acosta. So José de Acosta really is building on a tradition, but he is being far more systematic than Oviedo. Oviedo was a lay writer. He was connected to the Republic of Letters in Italy. As I have explained, that's why he was able to get his book very early on read in Italy and published. However, it is not possible to compare what he's doing in terms of intellectual work with José de Acosta. José de Acosta was a very well-educated man, as you know, a Jesuit of New Christian origins, who spent the 1570s and 80s in Peru, was immediately very important in designing a missionary policy. So very clearly his interest in the New World was not purely academic, it was part of a task, but who was able to write a book that combined the missionary concerns with general, what we call scientific concerns. And I would like to illustrate some of his philosophical ideas and methods very quickly in order to bring an appreciation of the sophistication with which these writers address those issues. I've talked about science, and you might say, well, surely we're not talking about science in the modern sense of the word in the 16th century. What you see in the Renaissance is, of course, the beginnings of a scientific revolution that too often is identified just with astronomy, mathematics, and physics, the kinds of things that Galileo or Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton will write about. However, very much Historia was a very important Renaissance genre that grew in value in the 16th century and provided something essential for science, which was new observations that could be verified. And the emphasis of the natural history genre is very much on newly observed facts, newly observed phenomena, which can then be used in order to correct theories. The idea is therefore not just empirical observations for the sake of empirical observations. There is a descriptive element, certainly, but the important point is that you think differently, and you, in particular, challenge authorities. You challenge the classical writers and identify their mistakes and limitations on the basis of these new observations. And here I think that Acosta is very clear. Also already Oviedo had made that an important theme. We are moderns, 16th century writers are saying. We are now able to see things that the ancients were not able to say. And that is the meaning of the word New World, of the concept of New World. It's not new just simply because it's opposed to the old in absolute terms. It's new because the ancients didn't know about it. It is in relation to the ancients that this novelty is valuable. And an idea of modernity really can be traced back to these writers. The idea that the 16th century people that we might see as very far from us are actually themselves developing a sense of modernity in terms of we have been able to see further and correct the ancients. Now, the kinds of things that, on the basis of putting observations against theories, Acosta will bring to the fore are things such as, why does latitude alone not determine climate? Why is tropical climate, for example, not, as the ancients imagine, uninhabitable? Why is there no torrid zone? One of the great mistakes of the ancients. New observations about volcanoes, about earthquakes, about winds, about tides. To what extent does climate, and climate meant not just the weather, not just humidity and rainfall, but also all kinds of, almost everything that you could define according to the nature of each place being different from other places. To what extent does climate affect the diversity of animals that we observe, the differences, the diversity in plants that we observe, and even the diversity of human temperaments that we observe? And here we're hitting a concept I'll come back to, temperament. The land, the climate has a specific temperament, and that affects everything, all its products, all the natural products, including human beings. Another theme that Acosta brings up is the relativity of time according to navigations, the fact that if you keep navigating across the world from Europe to the Americas, but then across the Pacific to the Philippines, you'll end up meeting people who are a day earlier than you. That is. And he rationalizes that and explains why it is the case. Now, talking about human beings, how do we connect the peoples of the New World to the peoples of the Old World? And here we got a very interesting phenomenon, which is that on the one hand, Acosta uses experience to challenge the mistakes of reason. Reason alone makes mistakes. You need experience in order to check that what you have rationalized is correct. That's why the torrid zone doesn't exist. Well, it should never have been thought of, but it was. It is possible to make a mistake. Very intelligent people, including great people like Augustine, who got it entirely right when it came to theology, you would say, get it wrong when it comes to something very fundamental about human geography. On the other hand, when you deal with the origins of the peoples of the New World, you do not begin just with experience. Yes, of course, there is an element of empiricism. Here are all these people, but there is another further element there, and these people must be connected to the peoples of the Old World because there is a biblical narrative that is assumed to be the case. So there is a subtle interplay here between assumptions that cannot be questioned and observations and reason. In any case, what is very interesting then is that Acosta, beginning with an assumption that cannot be questioned, we could say a dogma, builds up a train of reasoning that is scientific. So, assuming that the men are connected, without any knowledge of modern genetics, we're going to build a model of how you can connect these people who have no ships and no navigation to other people who are across the ocean. And then he explores all the possible ways of explaining that arrival and reaches a conclusion, which is that these people didn't come by ship, they come through migration. They came through gradual migration without even knowing that they were moving from one continent to the other, and then after they reached the New World, some of them became more civilized with time, but they migrated as hunter-gatherers and as savages. That is, of course, what a modern historian of the peopling of the Americas would end up saying. Acosta is doing that without archaeology, is doing that without genetics, is doing that simply on the basis of a dogma, and then using his observations and reasoning about which hypothesis would work. This is, of course, the most famous of his arguments, but he's got other very interesting ones about, for example, why is it that you are cold if you are in Peru? And of course, the very famous moment is when he is at the top of the Andes and begins to laugh hysterically, thinking about Aristotle. He should have been burning in an inhabitable zone, where he's freezing to death. And then he comes with an interesting theory about the way the winds and humidity affect climate and also altitude in relation to the sea level. I'm not going to give you absolutely every single thing, every single contribution in Acosta. I think I've just given you enough to get a sense of how this genre is a scientific genre, how history is scientific, because it's not just about facts, it's also about thinking about the natural world by testing the experience against theory. I'll just add one little thing, that one very interesting thing about the epistemology of Acosta, I don't want to forget, which is that his theory about knowledge, or how we acquire knowledge, his theory about how we acquire science, in effect, has a third element, which is the imagination. It's not just about experience and reason, it's also about the imagination. He acknowledges that without the imagination, we cannot think. That reason, logical arguments cannot give you enough. You need to build models with imagination. But you can easily be led astray by imagination. That's why Augustine got it wrong, or why the ancients got it wrong. So his model is one in which you test reason with facts, but you also use the imagination to build models and then test those models. So it's a very, very sophisticated reflection, all built on Aristotelian psychology, but applied to the new world. And here the question of novelty is the urge to refine the methodology. Now let's go now to the problem I said I would talk about as a particularly important problem, which is in the title of the book you have there, The Natural and Moral History of the Indies. It's natural so far, I've been making everything very natural, but what about the moral side? The moral side is about the fact that people are not just simply natural beings, they are also beings with a moral capacity, which according to, of course, the Catholic Christian understanding of human beings has an element that is free. The possibility of free choice. The possibility of free choice is what makes the history of human beings a moral history. So there is a kind of theological assumption behind this title. We could say that man is both a rational animal who participates in the natural as an animal, and also a spiritual being who's able to comprehend the will of God and the fact that the world is organized according to providential design because of this rational capacity. In addition to that, he's making choices, and he is responsible for those choices. Now, whilst this looks like a fairly neat division, on the one hand we have nature, on the other hand we have morality and customs, the problem is that by having human history and ethnography and customs within natural history, at some point it's not clear whether we're dealing with men as responding to nature through secondary causes, or men as supernatural beings, able to make moral choices that connect to the will of God. And here is where all this emphasis on customs is interesting, because customs created habits, and habits became like second nature. In addition, these were adaptative behaviors. The idea of temperaments was that each land created, it had its own nature, which was reflected in the animals, in the plants, in the climate, in the human beings. The temperaments, which according to the medical theory of the period would be described according to the humors, the four main humors of dry and wet and hot and cold, that those humors would come in different combinations in each region of the world. And that would condition the kinds of laws that people would have and the customs they would have. So there would be a sense in which human culture depended on its natural environment. It was not simply the creations of free beings, but the creation of free beings adapting to an environment. So all these could create questions about how far one could go. How far one could go in terms of geographical determinism. And these are some of the issues that my next Jesuit brought to the fore. And the two Jesuits I'll talk about, one is called Bernabé Cobo, and the other one is Francisco Zina, in some ways show how in the decades after Acosta, this relationship between the moral and the natural didn't remain stable, but there was a process by which the human was becoming more and more naturalized, and that created a tension on the theological structure. So I'll use some examples of that. This is the manuscript in Seville of the book by Bernabé Cobo. Unfortunately, it's not a very good picture, but it's available online now, the manuscript. There is some additions in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, which is when it was discovered, this great history. It was not fully translated into English, but only partly translated into English, because the sections on the Incas and the customs and religion were issued in two nice volumes, which I think one of them is in the display cabinet here. But the whole work, especially all the natural history, has never been translated into English. So if this here a student looking for a PhD topic or a project, you have a good one. It's an extraordinary text. Had it been published, which it was not, it would have been as important. In fact, as José Acosta's almost. In fact, I mean, Bernabé de Cobo is, for example, instrumental in bringing to Europe the cinchona, which is a bark used medicinally in the Andes that later leads to one of the most important cures against malaria. Quinine, is that how you say it in English? Quinine. So it's just an example of how this natural history was not, it was connected to practical medicine, was not just, again, pure curiosity. And this is just one example. It's a very ambitious work. I could describe it in great detail, but then it would take too long. Just simply say that we have not the whole work, but we have a very substantial part of the natural history of South America, and in particular Peru and the Andes. And what I will talk about today is that this history of the New World, which is how he calls it, history of the New World, deals with the question of the impact of nature on the American Indians. The Acosta model, which was the orthodox model, is that the American Indians were part of mankind, of the common mankind. At the same time, they were less civilized than Europeans. And the debate about the Americans had been to a very large extent to what extent were they capable of full civilization. And the issue had been settled in the 16th century very clearly, both by the papacy and by theologians of the School of Salamanca, with the urgings of Las Casas behind, that the American Indians were fully capable of being moral beings. Again, this capacity for free choice and salvation, therefore, but also perdition, against the temptation to think of them as animals less than human. However, that doesn't mean that they were considered to be identical to Europeans in all respects. And here is where people like Bernabé Cobo come with the use of the environmental theory in order to explain what he perceives as the shortcomings of the American Indians without going to the point of saying that they are less human than Europeans. So it's a kind of fine balancing act. The way he uses environmentalism is as follows. I'm going to quote now. Some lands, by virtue of their fertility, produce stronger, more robust men, and consequently, men with more physical stamina than other lands, which are sterile. The Indians, for example, were phlegmatic, moist, and that explained that they were slower than Europeans. They had less energy than the Spaniards. On the other hand, they had lots of endurance. They could forbear things better than the Spanish. That is how he rationalizes the differences that he observed in Peru. They were also sanguine, that is to say warm and moist, which expanded, which allowed for their great adaptability to high altitudes. He also observed that all Indians were very similar physically to each other in some respects that differed from the Spanish. For example, the color and connection, the color and shape of the eyes, the way the hair was distributed, the type of hair. The Spanish born in the Americas, interestingly enough, remained different in their body types and hair from the American Indians. So suddenly the environmental explanation ran to the ground. Even after 2-3 generations, the Spaniards were not acquiring the physical characteristics of the Indians. Whilst they might be acquiring some of the temperamental elements, they were not acquiring the full range of physical traits that were specific. So there was another element, which was a genetic element, an inheritance through blood, that had to be taken account of. Some writers today still will claim that there are races and that those races determine moral qualities. Surprisingly so, but it is still possible to find books that argue this. Jacobo, however, stopped short of any of those conclusions. He thought that there were physical differences, he thought there were differences in temperament, but he thought that when it came to moral capacities, precisely because that was a supernatural element, there could be no hierarchy. So it depended entirely on instruction and civilization. It was the extent to which they were educated that determined the moral capacity of the Indians. Having explained before how they had different attitudes towards less energetic, slower to think even, but not less capable of seeing the truth. This is just an example of a Jesuit grappling within natural history with the problem of how to balance the moral and the natural. His is not the only possible answer. I think that what I have showed with him is the extent to which there was a pressure to naturalize human diversity within the genre of natural history. There were a number of possible avenues to rationalize differences, some of which were fundamentally environmentalist, which was the most important paradigm for explaining human diversity in the Renaissance, some of which, however, pointed towards genetic arguments of inheritance, what they called blood in the period. And then I've also, I think, made clear the extent to which religious considerations created, and theological definitions created the fundamental boundaries for the final answers to some of these problems. And how the dogmas, in particular of the unity of mankind and the capacity for salvation of the American Indians, actually helped put a brake on the potentiality for more radical environmentalism or racism. Something that, of course, will change as the power of religion to dictate the framework for anthropology moves on in the 19th century. But I'll leave that for discussion later. I don't want to finish without mentioning the Philippines, because therefore I will have failed. So let's move on quickly to another text that was discovered in the 20th century, even later than Jacobo. And that's Francisco José Alcina's History of the Islands and the Indians of the Visayas. It's in the southern Philippines. The Jesuits were the last order to go to the Philippines, which, as you know, were colonized from Mexico through the Pacific navigations. And therefore, they were given the least desirable islands. The Augustinians, the Franciscans, and Dominicans had divided the island of Luzon. The best people, the Tagalos, according to their own understanding of what is better and worse Indians. The more civilized ones were the Tagalos. The more savage ones, they had tattoos everywhere, and had very peculiar sexual customs. I'm not going to go into detail now. We can leave that for a quick discussion. Those were the Visayans. Those were left for the Jesuits. Nevertheless, this man Alcina spent many years living with the Visayans and acquired an extraordinary knowledge of their culture. It is the example of the missionary as anthropologist. And he writes this history, which is, again, divided into the natural and the supernatural. But interesting, he doesn't do natural and moral. He does natural and supernatural. He's clearly read Acosta. He clearly is not comfortable with the division, and he, therefore, draws the distinction differently. What Alcina achieved primarily was a model ethnography for its systematicity, depth of analysis, and sympathy towards the Visayans and their natural environment. And he was particularly keen to go back to the trope of Oviedo and Acosta, that there are things that unless you experience them, you wouldn't have thought about them, that you really have to be open to learning from experience. And that people who only read books make mistakes, that you need to go there and experience it. I know, it's not a thing to say in a library, I'm sorry.
We try to get out on occasion.
That's, I'm sure you have day out in the fields, yeah. Well, in the case of the Byzantines, what's interesting is that he is talking about the religion of the Byzantines, the religion as part of the natural history, and then he leaves for the supernatural history everything to do to the Christianization of the islands. So supernatural only comes into play in connection to the arrival of Christianity, and that is the history of providential intervention through the Society of Jesus, of course, and the missionaries. But religion was already part of the customs of the American Indian, of the Byzantine islands, and therefore it belongs part of their Gentile past. And here again, the antiquity of and the Gentile past of the Indians becomes part of the natural. That creates also some questions. In the case of Acosta, he answered the questions by talking about the devil a lot. The devil explained false religion. He needed the devil in order to explain that, precisely because it needed to be rationalized in a providential context. In the case of Alsina, he doesn't elaborate as much as Acosta, but assumes the same answer. However, he does something else, which is to show the extent to which the human and the natural can only be studied together. And that's because you can only understand the nature of the islands if you know the local language of the Byzantine people. And you can only perceive the natural differences in the animals if you know the local language and culture. And he was a consummate philologist. He was bilingual. He was from Valencia, so he spoke Catalan and Spanish. So it was a very good starting point for learning Byzantine or English or any other language. So here the interaction is less environmentalism than philological. It's the key to science is language. But in this case, it's not Latin, it's Byzantine. Again, openness to local culture. And of course, he thought that this also had an instrumental value, in the same way as Cobo was interested in medicines to cure malaria, so was Alsina interested in the practical uses of animals and plants. Like Acosta, like Cobo, ultimately the Byzantine islands only needed instruction in order to become fully civilized. There was no limitation of how civilized they could become. Again, the religious assumptions pushed in that direction. So he accepted the assumption of most Jesuits that you build religion on civilization. You need to civilize in order to Christianize. But therefore, there is no limit to how civilized these people can be. And there's no limit to how Christian or good Christians they can be. Let me just finish now with a reflection on the New World again, the word New World. I have ended in the Philippines because I really wanted to make you feel how logically these three works stand together. Cobo was in Peru. He was a child in Andalusia when Acosta published his Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias in Seville in 1590. But he left very young. A few years later, he was already on the way to Peru. He spent most of his life in many different parts of Peru and Mexico. He developed this comprehensive view of the country. And then he wrote his book in 1653. He finished it then. But he was very clearly influenced by Acosta and going beyond Acosta. 10, 20 years later, in the Philippines, another Jesuit is also reading Acosta very clearly, also pushing the boundaries, and he's doing it in part of the same world, the same world. The Philippines were part of the same world. And he says it very clearly. He says, Bernabé Cobo says, we can talk about America, but it's not really fair because it was Columbus who discovered America, not Amerigo Vespucci. But I don't think we're going to get rid of the name America. I think it's here to stay. That's what he says. We can talk about the Western Indies, Indias Occidentales, which is the most common name, because that's Columbus went looking for the Indies, and we found the Indies in the West. But I prefer to talk about the New World, because the New World encompasses both the Indias Occidentales and all those areas of Asia that belong to the Crown of Castile. And that's what the New World is for Bernabé Cobo and for Francisco Alsina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan-Pau, for that incredibly intricate and for doing what you said you would do, which is always a good thing when you invite somebody. We have plenty of time to pick up on some of the threads that you revealed in your talk, and so the floor is open for anyone who would like to add. Hey.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's great. I just have a question about disease and how your writers are perhaps maybe a bit later. I'm more familiar with the Anglo context. We're thinking about native bodies and I guess the capacity for civilization, the capacity for Christianity. Whether people in the Iberian context thought about disease and were concerned about the possibility that native people could become civilized because they were dying out or they were biologically inferior. In the Anglo context, that's something that historians people have been talking about, and I just wondered if they see that transition happening over the course of the 17th century. And I just wondered in the Iberian context what disease does for natural histories of people.
And that's a very good question, which I will confess I haven't really done enough thought on. I mean, the reason why so many American Indians died so quickly was a bit of a mystery, as you know, in the period. And for people like Oviedo, it was all because they were sinful and they were being punished by God. So that's kind of the settler view, the settler who doesn't mind that the Indians are actually disappearing so much. From the point of view of the missionaries, of course, they were very torn because they were investing a lot of energy into Christianizing these people, and they were dying in mass. And I must say that by the time we're dealing with Acosta, Cobo, and Alsina, things have changed a bit, because of course the high point of the deaths takes place in previous decades, and the populations begin to stabilize. And clearly, I mean, by the middle of the 17th century, and in the case of the Philippines, which of course there was never the same degree of death as there had been in the Americas. So we don't have the same concerns. So I haven't seen this very clearly. However, it's a very important question. I'm sure some people know more about it, about how the different theories about whether there was an environment. I mean, of course, the idea is that these people, when they were living in their environment, before the arrival of the Spanish, had not been dying en masse. So obviously, a purely environmental explanation could not explain it. But I mean, I wonder if there's anyone here who can offer more thoughts, because I'm running out. Yeah.
I guess I have two questions, and I think they're quite different. But I guess I'm still thinking about the way that your talk was framed, about kind of the way that we want to globalize America.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking about Africans or people of African descent in the Americas during this period. And at least Acosta and Cobo are going to be aware of those people, even if they're not going to talk about them. And as Jesuits, the Jesuits are very aware. And if we think of the Jesuits as like global intellectuals of natural history, they are also communicating amongst themselves about this. So is the simple answer to say this is the difference between old world and new world conceptualizations of natural history? Because I would also think that Africans and people of African descent who are in fact enslaved to the Jesuits and accompanied them during this time are also disrupting these environments, are also part of the experiences. So, I mean, I really appreciated your talk, but I kept thinking about Jesuits and Africans, which is so much a part of this global American story.
Well, there is, of course, a very important contribution in the early 17th century to thinking about the Africans by a Jesuit who was in Cartagena, the Indies, which was Alonso de Sandoval, following Pedro Claver. But they were taking seriously the assumption I've been describing as fundamental, which is that all human beings are capable of spiritual perfection. They have to be baptized. At the same time, it's very clear that they were working as a very small group without much support. So it's quite clear that there was not a lot of support for work on the African slaves and for helping them, taking them seriously, compared with the bias towards the American Indians, which was inscribed in the legitimation of the empire. I mean, the whole empire was legitimized on evangelizing the Gentiles, whilst the Africans were brought as an economic resource, very clearly. And therefore, the discourse was very much about the legitimacy of buying them on the assumption that slavery was better than death, and if they had been caught in a just war, then it was legitimate to enslave them. That was not a bizarre theory. That was the dominant theory by the same school of Salamanca theologians who said the American Indians are full human beings and they have rights and you cannot dispossess them arbitrarily. The same people were saying there is this justification for slavery, which is that it's better to enslave than to kill. So the question is whether they were caught in just war or not. And then people like Alonso Salvador and others are saying actually, whether they were caught in a just war or not, they have to be also the objects of missionary effort. That's the first point they're making. The second one is some people doubt very much that they've been really caught in a just war. And that is where the big debate is, I believe. I'm sure that Roquinaldo Ferreira knows more about this.
Isn't there a clear distinction that the Jesuits are making a clear distinction between the old and the new world, and that people of the new world, who they are including the Philippines in, are getting a fresh start?
That's
versus
right.
The people of the old world, I mean, they are buying into that idea.
That's right. That's right. That's right. The idea, because the idea behind that, although some had argued that there had been an early Christianization of the Americas, the dominant idea is that they have not had a chance, and that the providential plan can only be fulfilled if everybody hears the gospel. So, well, in the case of Africa, it is part of the old world, and there were, of course, Christian kingdoms like Ethiopia, where you have black Christian rulers. They might be heretical, but so clearly that was the old world. Of course, in practical terms, where the people of Angola could be equated from the people of Ethiopia, that's another complicated.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering about the supernatural histories that you introduced at the end, and in two ways. One, in the discourse on the Philippines, which is where you introduced the term, is there any concern about it being a place where supernatural powers like the devil have more agency than other places in the world? Anything like that? And secondly, just on the philology part, does he think that the Bazayans have a language for God, or that just needs to be put into Latin, or do they have to be given a new language?
We don't have a theology of salvation for the Bazayans in the work so I cannot really answer the last question. He definitely values the language and defends its capacity. You can do anything with a Byzantine language, he thinks. He thinks it has amazing wealth. The real debates about the use of words like God had been in places like China or Japan, where there had been a theology that was alternative, for example, Buddhist concepts or Confucian concepts of the Lord of Heaven, that could lead to confusion. The use of Latin was not because you could only say God in Latin. It was because you could only avoid contamination if you avoided local words that might have the wrong associations. To the extent that that was not the case, that was not a problem then. So it was all about avoiding the wrong connotations, the wrong associations by the use of local words that led to the introduction of Deus or Dios. That would be the rationale for it. And there was the first part of your question? Yeah, the supernatural. Well, in reality, that is one of the big ambiguities that the work doesn't solve. The devil is clearly in the natural history, and God is clearly in the supernatural history. And that doesn't quite.
This is more like a commentary. Your lecture helped me to understand a little better the chroniclers of the early period. For example, Pedro Cieza de León.
Yes.
And I can see the natural history model right there. It's narrative, clearly. Yes. He starts narrating, he's coming to South America from Cartagena down to Cusco, practically. You can see clearly how he describes it's almost like a template that he has describing the landscape, the lands, the climate, natural resources, and then the Indians are part of the landscape. Clearly, it's like there's almost no break between the trees and the natives. And the natives are also described almost like as a pattern, always. There's always some paganism and some cannibalism. Although there's interesting instances of the Spaniards eating flesh, too, which is the only case where Cieza de León was able to witness cannibalism. The other ones he has heard from somebody else. But my comment wanted to also highlight that kind of template you see when he's describing everything in the territory of New Granada, and for the most part of Peru. But when he gets to Cusco, that changes completely. Because for him, the Cusco, the Inca people were civilized, in a way they were different from the other ones. So that pattern of landscape, including the natives or the indigenous peoples, it's broken somehow when he starts talking about the institutions of the Inca and the more similarity with the European.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is absolutely right. I mean, both, of course, Acosta and Cobo also talk a lot about the Incas in comparison to the more savage Indians. And the idea precisely is that they prove the capacity for civilization within native culture, that you have a civilizing force, a monarchy that prepares the ground for Christianity in some interpretations even. But you're right, because Pedro Cieza, to bring him up, he's a very interesting writer. He's a lay writer who's very unlike Oviedo in his sympathy, relative sympathy for the American Indians of South America, and in particular the Incas. And when I was asked to do an essay on a book I found at the JCB in a publication that came shortly after I was a fellow here called I Found It at the JCB, I chose Pedro Cieza León's Crónica del Perú as a book that I really loved reading here.
Last question, so we can turn to paganism for drinks.
The cult of Bacchus.
About the code, what do we know about, were there copies made of it? Did it circulate? It was obviously, from that page that you showed, it was obviously addressed to a wide audience, so to the reader, not to the king, to the Council of the Indies, or something like that. Why was it not published? What do we know about the fate of it?
Yeah, all these works were meant to be published, both Cobo and Alsina are writing with the idea of hoping to publish. And one of the big tragedies of Iberian ethnography and natural history is how much was not published. The authors, also Francisco Hernández, the great medical kind of like naturalist that goes on behalf of Philip II, is very frustrated. He wants to write not just for the king, he wants to write for the audience, for the Republic of Letters, for the nation, and they just don't get published. Now, there are various possible explanations. One of them is that it was very expensive to do, and you know that Spain was not economically a model of success in the 17th century. That is one question. The other issue, there's often been talked about ecclesiastical censorship and inquisition, but I don't buy it because these books were really books meant to be pious, and you were often see them approved and not published. So I think that the economic argument is actually important. It's who was going to spend money promoting the publication of those books. And of course, the other problem is a reading public. I think clearly the reading public was not strong enough compared to the reading public that would buy Theodore de Brie's volumes. I mean, these were very voluminous works. That the kings, the royalty didn't do enough to get things published is also true. I mean, clearly Philip II preferred to put the watercolors in El Escorial in his rooms there than to publish it for the people. So I think that was a very aristocratic, exclusive view of those books at the level of patronage that also weakened the possibilities for publication.
Before thanking Joan-Pau for his talk, I want to thank him specifically for underlining showing the relevance of natural history and ethnography as the precursors of histories of the environment as well, because I think that this is another area that we here at the library are trying to emphasize in showing the relevance of the early modern period for understandings of the relationship between humans and their environments. And I think you showed quite clearly that, especially in the last example, how these connections and relationships are absolutely dependent on observations and early observations and mitigated and mediated by language. So I think that's something that is another thread that I hope we can all continue to develop. I regret that I did not mention at first that Joan-Pau had also been, of course, a fellow at the JCB in 1991 and was a participant, lucky for him, in June of that year of an extraordinary conference on the Americas in America and European consciousness, which I'm sure some of you know as a publication that emerged out of that conference that Joan-Pau assures me is much less successful, was much less successful or interesting even than the conference itself. But I think
I would say it was not as, I think it didn't capture the full range.
Correct.
It was such a rich conference. I mean, of course.
Yeah. So anyway, this is a long and roundabout way of saying to Joan-Pau that for me personally, it's wonderful to be able to engage with somebody who was there as a young scholar participating in that, and who now has arrived at a place which I think bringing together a lot of the threads that emerged in that early conference.
This is my belated contribution to that conference.
Okay, well, let us offer him our belated thanks for coming.